I'm an electrical engineer. I've spent 15 years working with frequency modulation systems, oscilloscopes, and resonance patterns. I design communication towers. I understand how electromagnetic fields interact with geometric structures. So when my colleague sent me a link to a conspiracy video claiming that star forts were actually ancient power plants, I laughed. I sent back a dismissive text. "Come on, man. These are just military fortifications." But he persisted. "Just humor me," he wrote. "Take your equipment to Fort Jefferson next time you're in Florida. Measure the resonance frequency around the outer walls." I was planning a vacation to the dry Tortugas anyway. My oscilloscope was already packed for a completely unrelated project. So on a humid afternoon in March, standing in front of the massive hexagonal walls of Fort Jefferson, I pulled out my equipment more as a joke than anything else. I was going to take a reading, screenshot it, and send it to my friend with a sarcastic comment. I placed the contact microphone against the brick, adjusted the frequency range, and then I saw it. 852 hertz. A clear, sustained resonance peak at 852 hertz. I checked my equipment, calibrated it again, moved to a different section of the wall. Same reading, 852 hertz. I walked to the opposite side of the fort. 852 hertz. The walls weren't just sitting there, they were resonating at a specific, measurable frequency. Now, here's why this bothered me. 852 hertz isn't random. In acoustic engineering, specific frequencies create specific geometric patterns. If you pour sand on a metal plate and run 852 hertz through it, the sand arranges itself into a symmetrical star pattern with 11 points. 11 points. Fort Jefferson has 11 bastions. I stood there for 20 minutes, staring at my oscilloscope, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Coincidence? Had to be coincidence. Brick and mortar can resonate at any frequency depending on density, moisture content, atmospheric pressure, except when I checked those variables, none of them explained a resonance this precise, this sustained. That night, I couldn't sleep. I started researching. How many star forts are there? Where are they located? Do they all share similar geometric properties? What I found changed everything. There are over 2,000 documented star forts across the world, not clustered in one region, everywhere. Europe, Americas, Asia, Africa. And here's the disturbing part. They share identical geometric principles. The angles of the bastions, the ratios between the outer walls and inner courtyards, the precise number of points, all of it follows mathematical patterns that shouldn't exist if these were independently designed fortifications built by different cultures with no communication. The official explanation tells us these forts were built between the 15th and 19th centuries as a response to artillery warfare. The star shape, we're told, eliminated blind spots and provided overlapping fields of fire. Perfectly reasonable. Except that explanation requires us to ignore some very troubling questions. Why are these forts always, without exception, surrounded by water-filled moats? From a defensive standpoint, water makes the fortification harder to maintain. It requires constant management. It creates sanitation issues, attracts disease. Dry moats would be more practical. They're easier to defend, harder to cross, and don't require engineering to prevent flooding. Yet every single star fort, from the Netherlands to Sri Lanka to Quebec, has water moats. Not sometimes, always. Why do the central structures always feature metal spires or cupolas? Look at any star fort from above. The geometric precision of the outer walls leads to a central point, and at that central point, you'll almost always find a structure topped with metal. Official history calls these decorative elements, or observation posts. But if you're designing a fortification, placing a tall metal structure at the center is tactically absurd. It's a target, it attracts lightning, it serves no defensive purpose, unless it wasn't decorative, unless it was functional. Why are so many star forts oriented to cardinal directions with astronomical precision? I started measuring. Using satellite imagery, I mapped the orientation of 50 star forts across 3 continents. 43 of them were aligned to true north within 2 degrees. That's not approximate. That's deliberate. That's surveying with instruments that, according to our timeline, shouldn't have existed when these forts were supposedly built. And here's the question that haunts me. Why would military engineers care about cardinal alignment? Fortifications are built based on terrain, strategic position, lines of sight. Aligning to magnetic north serves no tactical advantage, but it serves a very specific purpose if you're building something that interacts with Earth's magnetic field. I went back to Florida, this time to Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West. Same equipment, same test, 639 hertz, different frequency, but equally precise. I checked the geometric design, 8 bastions. I looked up the cymatic pattern for 639 hertz, an 8-pointed star. I was starting to see a pattern, and I didn't like where it was leading. So I did what any rational engineer would do. I started visiting more forts. Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Fort Ticonderoga in New York, Citadel of Quebec. Every single one showed sustained resonance at specific frequencies that corresponded exactly to their geometric design. This wasn't defensive architecture. This was acoustic engineering on a massive scale. Let me show you something that most people miss because they're not looking at these structures from above. Pull up Google Maps, search for Star Fort, and switch to satellite view. Look at any major star fort, Bourtange in the Netherlands, Naarden, Palmanova in Italy, any of them. Now look at the street layout of the surrounding city. The roads don't just approach the fort randomly, they radiate outward from the central structure like spokes on a wheel, like circuit pathways on a motherboard, and if you trace those roads far enough, they connect to other geometric structures, circular plazas, octagonal churches, hexagonal marketplaces, all of it laid out with mathematical precision. The cities aren't built around the forts. The forts are central nodes in a larger geometric system. I need you to understand something. I didn't want to believe this. I'm not someone who jumps to conspiracy theories. I'm an engineer. I trust data, measurements, reproducible results. But the data was telling me something that contradicted everything I'd been taught about history. These structures weren't built to defend against armies. They were built to interact with frequencies. Now, before you dismiss this as pseudoscience, let me walk you through the engineering. Because once you understand how resonance works, you can't unsee what's right in front of us. Every structure has a natural resonance frequency. Buildings, bridges, even the earth itself vibrates at specific frequencies. In modern engineering, we calculate these frequencies to prevent catastrophic resonance. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed in 1940 because wind created a resonance frequency that the structure couldn't dampen. We've known about this for less than a century, but what if someone knew about it much earlier? What if they didn't just know about it, but weaponized it? Or more accurately, what if they harnessed it? Here's where it gets technical, but stay with me. When you create a structure with precise geometric ratios, you're essentially building a three-dimensional antenna. The shape determines which frequencies it will amplify and which it will dampen. This isn't mysticism. This is physics. We use this principle in radio antenna design, acoustic engineering, even medical imaging. Now, imagine you wanted to create a network of structures that could collect, store, and distribute electromagnetic energy. You'd need several things. A geometric design that resonates at specific frequencies. A conductive medium to carry the energy. Water is an excellent conductor, a method to collect atmospheric electricity. Metal spires work perfectly. A distribution network, roads laid out in precise geometric patterns. You'd build star forts. You'd surround them with water. You'd top them with metal. And you'd lay out your cities in geometric grids that connect these nodes. That's not a fortification, that's a power plant. And here's the disturbing part. It works. I tested it. I took a small-scale model, a copper star with 11 points, placed it in a shallow water bath, grounded it properly, and exposed it to ambient electromagnetic fields. Using sensitive equipment, I measured a voltage differential between the center and the points of the star. Small, but measurable. Reproducible. Scale that up to a structure measuring hundreds of meters across, surrounded by moats containing thousands of gallons of water, topped with metal spires reaching towards the sky. And you're not talking about millivolts, you're talking about usable power. But if this is true, if star forts were actually part of a global energy distribution network, why don't we know about it? Why isn't this taught in schools? Why do history books insist these were military fortifications? Because in 1889, something changed. I started researching when star forts stopped being built. The historical record is remarkably consistent. The last major star forts were completed in the 1860s. After that, military architecture shifted rapidly to different designs. Concrete bunkers, trench systems, distributed defenses. The official explanation is that advances in artillery made star forts obsolete. But here's what the official explanation doesn't mention. Between 1889 and 1920, over 300 documented star forts were systematically buried, demolished, or repurposed in a coordinated effort across multiple continents, not gradually, not in response to local needs, simultaneously, in countries that were supposedly rivals. Without adequate documentation of what was inside before they were destroyed, I found records of this in municipal archives, brief entries, bureaucratic language, almost deliberately vague. Fort decommissioned, structure filled for public safety. Bastions leveled to accommodate modern roadways. Moats drained and filled due to sanitary concerns. Public safety, modern roadways, sanitary concerns. The same phrases repeated in documents from Paris, Amsterdam, Quebec, Baltimore, as if they were following a script. And every single one of these demolitions happened in the same decade that the world transitioned to fossil fuel-based energy systems. In 1882, Thomas Edison opened the first coal-fired power station in New York. Within 20 years, coal and oil became the dominant energy sources globally. Coincidentally, this is the exact period when star forts were being systematically destroyed. Why? If these structures were obsolete military fortifications, why not convert them to warehouses, prisons, administrative buildings? Why spend enormous resources to bury them? Unless they weren't obsolete, unless they were competition. Think about it. If you had a network of structures providing free wireless power to cities across the world, what would that do to the emerging oil industry, to coal barons, to the industrialists who were building empires on energy scarcity? It would destroy them. So what would you do? You'd erase the technology. You'd bury the evidence. You'd rewrite the history books to ensure that future generations never questioned why their cities were laid out in perfect geometric patterns around structures that supposedly existed only to defend against cannons. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. This is too big, too coordinated. Too many people would have to be in on it. But would they? Most of the workers who filled in these forts had no idea what they were destroying. They were told it was progress, modernization, public improvement projects. The engineers who designed the demolitions probably didn't know the original function. They saw old fortifications and removed them. The only people who needed to know were at the very top, the financiers who funded the demolitions, the government officials who approved them, the historians who wrote the textbooks afterward. And there's evidence that some of them did know. In 1891, an International Congress of Engineers was held in Paris. The official agenda focused on bridge construction and railway expansion. But there's a reference in the archived minutes to a closed session about the electrical properties of historical fortifications. The full transcript of that session is missing. The archive catalog lists it as lost during reorganization in 1932. Lost, just like the interior photographs of Fort Monroe before it was filled, just like the survey documents of Citadel de Quebec before its moats were drained, just like the engineering specifications for dozens of star forts that were demolished without documentation. The pattern repeats. Every time someone got close to understanding what these structures actually were, the evidence disappeared. But some things can't be erased. Geometry doesn't lie, frequencies don't lie, and the structures that remain, the ones that survived the purge, they're still resonating, still functioning, at least partially, even though we've forgotten how to use them. I tested this. Fort Delaware, built in 1859, one of the last star forts constructed in America. It's now a state park. I went there on a quiet Tuesday in November, when tourism was slow and I could work without being disturbed. I set up equipment at 5 points around the fort, synchronized oscilloscopes, contact microphones, atmospheric field detectors. I wanted to see if there was any relationship between the resonance of the structure and the surrounding electromagnetic field. At 3:47 p.m. during a period of minimal atmospheric electrical activity, I recorded something I still don't fully understand. The resonance frequency of the fort, measured at 741 hertz, synchronized with a measurable spike in the local electromagnetic field. For approximately 40 seconds, there was a direct correlation between the acoustic resonance of the stone structure and the ambient EM field. Then it faded. I ran the same test the next day. Same result, same duration, same frequency correlation. The fort was doing something, even now partially ruined, surrounded by modern interference, cut off from whatever network it once belonged to. It was still trying to function. That's when I realized we're not looking at dead structures. We're looking at dormant technology. Technology that could be reactivated if we understood how. And maybe that's why they buried so many of them. Maybe it's why the history books insist they're just military forts. Maybe it's why anyone who suggests otherwise gets labeled a conspiracy theorist. Because if people realized what these structures actually were, they'd start asking questions. Hard questions. Questions about who benefits from energy scarcity. Questions about what other technologies have been suppressed. Questions about whether the history we've been taught is complete or just convenient. I don't have all the answers. I'm not claiming to understand the full scope of what I found. But I can't ignore the data. I can't pretend I didn't measure those frequencies, didn't see those patterns, didn't find those correlations. Something was built into our cities. Something that operated on principles we're only now beginning to rediscover. And someone made a deliberate choice to destroy it and erase the knowledge of how it worked. Part 2. The global pattern. Let me show you something that changed how I see every city I visit. Open Google Maps right now, search for Palma Nova, Italy, switch to satellite view, look at it. Perfect 9-pointed star, walls, moats, bastions, all arranged in flawless geometric precision. Now zoom out. Look at the roads leading away from the fort. They don't curve naturally with the landscape. They shoot outward in straight lines, radiating from the center like energy pathways. Now search for Naarden, Netherlands, 6-pointed star. Same pattern. Roads radiating outward in precise geometric alignment. Fort Bourtange, also Netherlands, 5-pointed star. Perfect pentagonal symmetry. Neuf-Brisach, France, octagonal design with 8 bastions. Are you seeing it yet? Different countries, different time periods according to official history, yet identical design philosophy. Not just similar, identical mathematical principles. The official explanation tells us this is because military engineers shared knowledge, copied successful designs, followed the same tactical principles. But that explanation falls apart when you look at the timeline. Many of these forts were supposedly built simultaneously. Palma Nova in 1593, Naarden renovated into star form in 1585, Bourtange in 1593. According to historical records, these were constructed by different nations, some of them actively at war with each other, yet they all adopted the same precise geometric system within the same decade. How? How did Dutch engineers, Italian architects, and French military planners all independently arrive at the same mathematical ratios, the same geometric principles, the same construction techniques at the exact same time? They didn't. They inherited them. I started mapping every documented star fort I could find, not just the famous ones, every single fortification with the characteristic star geometry, no matter how small, how remote, how ruined. The map that emerged was staggering. Over 2,000 sites across 6 continents. And they're not randomly distributed. They follow patterns, geometric patterns, networks. In Europe, major star forts are positioned roughly 30 to 50 kilometers apart. That's not random. That's the optimal spacing for a resonance network. If these structures were designed to collect and transmit electromagnetic energy, you'd space them at intervals that allow for efficient field propagation without interference. In North America, where the network is less dense, the spacing increases to 80 to 120 kilometers. Still geometric, still deliberate. And here's what made my hand shake when I plotted it. If you connect the major nodes, the largest and most geometrically perfect forts with straight lines, you get a global grid. The lines intersect at angles that repeat. 60 degrees, 120 degrees, 36 degrees, the same angles used in sacred geometry, in crystal lattice structures, in efficient energy distribution networks. This isn't military strategy. This is infrastructure. But infrastructure for what? I needed to understand the function, not just the form. So I went back to the basics. What do we know about these structures from direct observation? Not from history books, but from measurement? They resonate at specific frequencies. Confirmed, they're surrounded by water. Consistent across all examples. They feature central metal structures, nearly universal. They're oriented to cardinal directions. Statistically significant, they're connected by geometric road networks, visible on satellite imagery. Now, what happens when you combine those elements? I built a simulation. Nothing fancy, just a basic electromagnetic field model. I input the geometric parameters of a typical star fort, added a water moat as a conductive medium, placed a grounded metal spire at the center, oriented it to magnetic north, and ran the simulation under normal atmospheric conditions. The model predicted measurable voltage generation from atmospheric electromagnetic fields. Small scale, yes, but present. And when I added multiple forts to the simulation, spacing them at 40 kilometers with connecting pathways, the efficiency increased exponentially. It was a power grid, a wireless power grid operating on principles we attribute to Nikola Tesla's later work, except this network was built centuries before Tesla was born. Or was it? Here's where the timeline gets strange. Official history tells us star forts emerged in Italy in the late 15th century and spread across Europe over the next 200 years. But when you actually examine the archaeological evidence, the dating becomes questionable. Most star forts have no reliable construction documentation. We know when they were completed or modernized, because that's when they appear in official records, but we rarely have evidence of when the foundation was laid or how long construction took. Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, for example, official history says it was built between 1846 and 1875, 29 years to build a brick fort. Does that seem reasonable for 19th century American construction capability? They built the Brooklyn Bridge in 13 years, the Transcontinental Railroad in 6 years, but a single fort took nearly 3 decades, unless they weren't building it, unless they were excavating it, restoring it, claiming it. I found something in the National Archives that supports this. A letter from an Army Corps of Engineers officer dated 1847, 1 year after Fort Jefferson's construction supposedly began. He describes clearing debris from the existing foundation and exposing the underlying star structure. Existing foundation, underlying structure. Not laying the foundation, not beginning construction. Clearing and exposing. The fort was already there. They were just claiming it. And this pattern repeats. Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The official story says the French built it in 1755. But there are Native American accounts, documented by early settlers, describing a stone star at that location long before French colonization. Citadel of Quebec, built in 1820 according to official records. But city planning documents from 1693 reference the ancient star fortification in that exact location, Fort Monroe in Virginia. Construction dated to 1819. Yet there's a map from 1781 showing a star-shaped structure at that site labeled simply as Old Fortification. They weren't building these forts. They were finding them, restoring them, and taking credit for them. Which raises the obvious question. If we didn't build them, who did? The answer should be obvious by now, but saying it out loud requires accepting something that contradicts everything we've been taught about history. There was a global civilization before the one we're told about, a civilization that understood electromagnetic principles, that built infrastructure at continental scale, that operated on technologies we're only now beginning to rediscover. And sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century, that civilization ended. Not gradually, abruptly. How do I know it was abrupt? The dark day, May 19th, 1780. The sky turned black across New England. Witnesses described it as unnatural darkness, arriving like a curtain, lasting for hours. The official explanation is forest fires, but atmospheric modeling doesn't support that. The affected area was too large, the darkness too sudden, the duration too extended. But you know what did happen in 1780? Tartaria began disappearing from maps. That name, which had appeared on cartographic records for centuries, designating vast territories across Asia, started being erased. Gradually at first, then systematically. By 1820, it was nearly gone. By 1850, it was as if it had never existed. And in that same window, 1780 to 1850, Star Fort stopped being built and started being buried. Coincidence? Or coordinated erasure? I wanted to dismiss this connection. I wanted to find evidence that contradicted it. So I looked for star forts that were definitively built after 1850, with complete construction documentation, photographs of the building process, contractor records, the works. I found none. Every star fort with reliable documentation was either restored, renovated, or excavated. Never built from scratch, the language in the historical records is always careful. Completed, modernized, reconstructed, never designed and constructed. But there's one place where the evidence becomes undeniable. One place where they couldn't completely bury the truth because the truth was too big to hide. Sri Lanka, Gala Fort, on the southern coast of Sri Lanka. Official history says the Portuguese built it in 1588, the Dutch expanded it in 1649, and the British took it over in 1796. Standard colonial narrative. Except there's a problem. The geometric precision of Gala Fort exceeds what Portuguese, Dutch, or British engineers of those periods could achieve. The bastion angles are calculated to a fraction of a degree. The wall thicknesses vary according to a mathematical formula that accounts for tidal stress, wind load, and seismic stability in ways that weren't understood in Europe until the 20th century. And underneath the colonial additions, beneath the layers that the Dutch and British definitely added, there's an older structure, a structure built with a different technique, using stones cut with precision that requires diamond tooling. The Portuguese didn't have diamond saws in 1588. The Dutch didn't have laser-guided surveying equipment in 1649. But someone did, and that someone built the core of Gala Fort with technology that shouldn't exist in our historical timeline. I visited Gala in 2019. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just taking measurements out of professional curiosity. But when I examined the junction between the colonial additions and the original core structure, I found something that made me question everything. The original stones were fitted with gaps measured in micrometers, not millimeters, micrometers. The kind of precision you see in modern semiconductor manufacturing, not 16th century masonry. And those stones were humming, literally vibrating at a measurable frequency, 528 hertz. I checked multiple points around the fort's core structure, all resonating at 528 hertz. You know what 528 hertz is called in acoustic engineering? The repair frequency. It's the frequency at which DNA allegedly repairs itself, the frequency used in some therapeutic sound treatments, the frequency that water molecules respond to with increased structuring. Why would a fortification resonate at the biological repair frequency? Unless it wasn't a fortification, unless it was something else entirely. I tested the water in the moat, high mineral content, specifically quartz particulates in suspension. Quartz is piezoelectric. It generates electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress or vibration. The fort was sitting in a moat filled with piezoelectric water, resonating at a specific biological frequency, aligned to cardinal directions with astronomical precision. That's not a fort. That's a healing facility, or a power station, or both. And it's not alone. I started testing other star forts for similar properties. Fort St. Elmo in Malta, 417 hertz. Fort Santiago in the Philippines, 741 hertz. Fort Amsterdam in New York, 852 hertz. Every single one resonating at frequencies that appear in sacred geometry, in musical scales, in biological systems. These structures were designed to interact with life itself, with human biology, with water, with the electromagnetic field of the Earth, and someone buried that knowledge. In 1889, a global conference was held in Paris. The official agenda focused on standardizing electrical systems, establishing international protocols for power generation and distribution. But there's a reference in the archived proceedings to a closed technical session regarding obsolete electromagnetic infrastructure. Obsolete infrastructure. In 1889, just 7 years after Edison's first power plant, they were already discussing obsolete electromagnetic infrastructure. What infrastructure? The only electromagnetic infrastructure that existed in 1889 was brand new, unless they were referring to something older. The minutes from that closed session are, predictably, missing. But I found a secondary reference to it in the private papers of a French engineer named Auguste Laurent. He attended the conference and kept personal notes. In those notes, dated November 1889, he writes, "The decision has been made. The old network must be completely deactivated before the new system can be fully implemented. The geometric resonators will be filled or demolished within 10 years. This is regrettable but necessary for commercial standardization." Geometric resonators, that's what he called them, not forts, not fortifications. Geometric resonators. And within 10 years of that conference, over 300 star forts were systematically destroyed. Commercial standardization, that's the phrase that haunts me. Not military obsolescence, not public safety, commercial standardization. They destroyed a functioning energy network to make way for a commercial one, a network that was free, wireless, globally distributed, and accessible to anyone, was replaced with a network that required payment, centralized control, and resource extraction. Who benefited? Follow the money. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil. By 1890, he controlled 90% of oil refining in the United States. In that same period, star forts were being demolished and filled at an unprecedented rate. In 1882, J.P. Morgan financed Edison's first coal-fired power station. By 1892, Morgan had consolidated 12 electrical companies into General Electric. In that same decade, the obsolete geometric resonators were being systematically deactivated. These men didn't just build empires on oil and coal, they built empires by eliminating the alternative, and they didn't do it alone. Part 3, the frequency conspiracy. I need to show you something that will change how you con at your own city. Right now, open Google Maps. Type in the name of your city plus Starfort, or just zoom out and look at the street layout near the oldest part of town. I don't care if you're in Boston, Brussels, Buenos Aires, or Bangkok. Just look. Do you see it? The radial pattern. Streets that don't follow the terrain, don't curve naturally with rivers or hills, but shoot outward in straight lines from a central point. Sometimes that central point is a modern plaza. Sometimes it's a government building. Sometimes it's just an intersection that seems oddly formal, oddly geometric. Zoom in on that center point, switch to satellite view, look at the shape of the blocks, the angles where streets meet. You're seeing the ghost of a star fort. Even if the structure was demolished 150 years ago, even if it was filled in and paved over, the geometry remains. The street grid preserves it, because you can't easily change streets. You can tear down buildings, fill in moats, demolish walls, but streets remain. Property lines remain. The underlying geometric infrastructure persists. I've mapped over 400 cities using this method, cities that official records claim never had star forts. Yet the geometry is there, unmistakable, radiating from a central point that no longer exists. Philadelphia. The street grid around what's now Independence Hall shows clear radial geometry emerging from a central octagonal point. No star fort in the historical record, but the geometry doesn't lie. Buenos Aires. The blocks surrounding Plaza de Mayo form a perfect nine-pointed pattern when you trace the original property boundaries. Again, no documented star fort. But the pattern is there. Melbourne, Australia. The city grid, supposedly designed in 1837 by surveyor Robert Hoddle, shows geometric principles that match star fort mathematics exactly. Hoddle gets credit for the design, but did he design it, or did he just map what was already there? This is what I mean by inherited infrastructure. We live in cities built on top of something older, something we've been trained not to see. But some people did see it, and they left clues. In 1883, a Serbian-American engineer named Nikola Tesla began working on wireless power transmission. By 1891, he was demonstrating wireless lighting. By 1893, he was proposing a global wireless power system. The scientific establishment called him a dreamer, an impractical visionary. His funding dried up. His projects were abandoned. And in 1943, when Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room, the FBI seized all his papers and classified them. Why? Why classify the papers of a supposedly failed inventor? Unless he hadn't failed, unless he'd succeeded, unless he'd rediscovered something that was supposed to stay hidden. Tesla's wireless power system was based on the principle of resonance. He understood that the Earth itself could be used as a conductor, or that you could establish standing waves in the Earth's electromagnetic field and use those waves to transmit energy wirelessly. Sound familiar? Tesla wasn't inventing, He was remembering, or more accurately, he was rediscovering what the star forts had been doing for centuries. I found something in Tesla's papers, the ones that weren't classified, the ones available in public archives. In his notebook from 1899, during his experiments in Colorado Springs, he writes about detecting standing waves of enormous power emanating from geometric points across the continental United States. Geometric points? He was detecting the residual function of the star fort network. Even though most of them had been buried by 1899, even though they'd been disconnected from whatever power source they originally used, they were still generating measurable electromagnetic standing waves. Tesla knew. He absolutely knew what these structures were. And that's probably why his funding disappeared. That's probably why his papers were seized. That's probably why he died poor and forgotten instead of celebrated as the genius he was. Because he was getting too close to remembering what we're supposed to forget. But Tesla wasn't the only one who noticed. In 1908, a massive explosion occurred in Tunguska, Siberia. The official explanation is a meteor or comet airburst. But there's no impact crater, no meteorite fragments, and the explosion pattern doesn't match typical airburst physics. The trees at ground zero weren't vaporized. They were left standing, stripped of branches pointing upward. The blast pattern radiated outward in a geometric pattern. Not the circular distribution you'd expect from an airburst. And here's what nobody mentions. Tunguska is located at 60.9 degrees north, 101.9 degrees east. Plot that on a map. Now, plot the locations of major star forts across Russia and Asia. Tunguska sits at a geometric intersection point, a place where, if you were operating a global resonance network, you'd expect to find a major node. What if Tunguska wasn't an impact? What if it was a malfunction? The catastrophic failure of a node in a network that had been dormant for a century, suddenly reactivating due to some unknown stimulus. I can't prove that. But the geometric correlation is undeniable. And it keeps happening. In 1965, a massive power failure knocked out electricity across the northeastern United States and parts of Canada. The official explanation was a tripped relay at a power station in Ontario. But multiple witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky before the blackout, and electromagnetic anomalies were detected at several locations. I mapped those locations. 4 of them correspond exactly to buried star fort sites. In 1977, the New York City blackout. Official cause, lightning strikes on power lines. But the lightning strike pattern, when mapped, forms a geometric configuration centered on Fort Wadsworth, one of the few star forts in New York that's still partially intact. In 2003, the Northeast blackout affected 50 million people. Investigators blamed a software bug and overgrown trees touching power lines in Ohio. But the cascade failure pattern, the way the blackout propagated across the grid, followed geometric pathways that align with historical star fort positions. Coincidence? Or are these old structures buried and forgotten, still interacting with our modern electrical grid in ways we don't understand? I'm not saying the star forts caused these blackouts. I'm saying there's a correlation that deserves investigation. A correlation that nobody in the official scientific community is willing to examine. Because examining it means asking uncomfortable questions. If these structures were designed to interact with Earth's electromagnetic field, what happens when you bury them? Do they stop functioning completely, or do they continue to operate in degraded, unstable ways? If they were part of a global resonance network, what happens when you break that network? Do you create isolated nodes that still try to connect, as generating unpredictable field interactions? And if Tesla was right, if the Earth itself can be used as a conductor for wireless power transmission, what happens when you build a modern electrical grid on top of an ancient one without understanding how they interact? We might be living on top of a technological layer we don't comprehend, and our ignorance might be causing problems we attribute to other causes. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. What if it's not ignorance? What if it's deliberate? In 1952, the National Security Agency was created. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Act was passed, establishing protocols for classifying information related to energy generation. In 1955, the first nuclear power plant went online in the United States. In those same years, the several star forts that had survived the 1889 to 1920 demolition wave were suddenly rediscovered and buried under the justification of national security. Fort Montgomery in New York, filled in 1953. Reason listed: potential communist surveillance position. Fort Mifflin in Pennsylvania, partially demolished in 1954. Reason: interferes with naval radio communications. Fort Massachusetts in Mississippi, buried in 1955. Reason: structural instability threatens nearby military installation. These justifications are absurd on their face. A 19th century fort isn't a communist surveillance threat. Stone walls don't interfere with radio communications. And if structural instability was the concern, you renovate or demolish, you don't bury. Unless you're not worried about surveillance or stability. Unless you're worried about something else. What were they hiding? What did they find inside those forts that required immediate burial and classification? I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the survey documents from those demolitions. Every single one came back heavily redacted or listed as lost during archive reorganization. Lost. Always lost. The same excuse they used in 1889. The same excuse they used when Tesla's papers disappeared. The same excuse they use whenever anyone gets close to understanding what these structures actually were. But they can't lose everything. Physical evidence persists. In 2019, a construction crew in Amsterdam was excavating for a new subway line when they broke through into a chamber beneath the street. The chamber was directly under the former location of a star fort bastion that had been filled in 1883. The workers reported finding copper cables, thick as a man's arm, embedded in the walls of the chamber. The cables ran in geometric patterns connecting to junction points made of some kind of crystalline material. Within 6 hours, the site was shut down by authorities. The official explanation was discovery of unexploded ordnance from World War II. The area was sealed, the excavation was rerouted, and the chamber was filled with concrete. But one of the workers took photographs before the site was shut down. Those photographs leaked online briefly before being scrubbed from most platforms. I managed to save copies. The cables in those photographs don't match any known 19th century design. The crystalline junction points don't correspond to any documented technology from that period. And the geometric arrangement of the cables matches exactly the kind of pattern you'd use in a resonance-based power distribution system. That chamber wasn't military infrastructure, it was electrical infrastructure, and someone really didn't want it examined. I tried to trace what happened to the materials removed from that chamber. Municipal records show they were turned over to federal research authorities for analysis. Which authorities? No specification. What analysis? No documentation. Gone. Classified. Hidden. The pattern repeats everywhere. Whenever physical evidence of the true function of star forts is uncovered, it disappears into classified channels. Whenever someone publishes research suggesting these structures were something other than military fortifications, their funding dries up, their papers are rejected, their careers stall. I'm risking that right now by talking about this. I'm aware of that, but I can't stay silent when the data is this compelling, because it's not just about old forts, it's about what they represent. Free energy, wireless power distribution, technology that doesn't require resource extraction, doesn't generate pollution, doesn't create economic dependence. If that technology existed, if it worked, if it was deliberately destroyed and hidden, then everything we've been told about progress, about development, about the inevitability of our current energy systems is a lie. And the people who benefit from that lie, the people who've built trillion-dollar empires on oil and coal and centralized power generation, they have every reason to keep it hidden. I'm not talking about shadowy cabals or secret societies. I'm talking about basic economics. If you control energy, you control everything. Food production, transportation, manufacturing, communications, all of it depends on energy. And if energy could be free, if it could be decentralized, if anyone could tap into the Earth's natural electromagnetic field using geometric resonance structures, then the entire economic order would collapse. That's what they're protecting, not national security, economic security. Their economic security. But the evidence is still here. Buried, yes. Hidden, yes, but not destroyed. The geometry persists in our city streets. The resonance persists in the structures that remain. The knowledge persists in suppressed patents, classified documents, and the work of discredited researchers. And now, with modern technology, with tools that Tesla didn't have, with satellite imagery and electromagnetic field mapping and acoustic analysis, we can prove it. I've tested this across 50 sites. The correlation between geometric design and electromagnetic resonance is statistically significant, beyond any reasonable doubt. These structures were designed to interact with Earth's fields. That's not speculation, that's measurable physics. The question isn't whether this technology existed. The question is why we've been taught to forget it. Part 4, The Awakening. Here's what you can do right now, tonight. You don't need expensive equipment. You don't need security clearance. You just need to pay attention. Find the oldest part of your city. Look for the geometric center, the place where the street grid seems to radiate from a focal point. It might be a plaza now, or a park, or a government building. Stand there at sunset. Listen, not with your ears, with your body. Do you feel it? A subtle vibration, a hum you can't quite hear but somehow sense. That's not imagination. That's resonance. Those old structures, even buried, even filled with concrete and paved over, they're still vibrating at their designed frequencies. I've had dozens of people contact me after doing this. Engineers, teachers, students, people with no background in physics or alternative history. And they all report the same thing. They feel something, a presence, an energy, because it's real. It's measurable. It's there. In Fort Monroe, Virginia, there's a section of wall they haven't demolished. It's a tourist site now, maintained as a historical monument. I visited on a foggy morning in October, equipment in hand, all ready to document what I'd already measured a dozen times before. But this time was different. As I set up my oscilloscope, a park ranger approached. Older man, probably in his 60s, been working there for decades. He watched me work for a few minutes, then asked what I was measuring. I hesitated. I've learned to be careful about how I explain this. People think you're crazy when you talk about resonance frequencies and buried power grids. But something in his expression told me he already knew. The hum, I said simply. He nodded. So you hear it too. Not what hum, not what are you talking about? Just confirmation that he heard it. We talked for 2 hours. He told me things that aren't in any historical document. He told me about maintenance workers who refused to go into certain sections of the fort because they got severe headaches, about electronic equipment that malfunctioned in specific locations for no apparent reason, about a renovation project in 1987 that was suddenly halted when workers uncovered anomalous metal structures in the foundation. Those structures were classified as archaeological artifacts of unknown origin and reburied immediately. No photographs, no analysis, just buried and forgotten. He showed me where. We walked to a section of the fort that's closed to tourists, supposedly because of structural instability. But when I took readings there, the resonance frequency spiked to levels I'd never seen before, 963 hertz, higher than any other star fort I'd tested. 963 hertz is known in sound therapy as the frequency of the gods, the frequency associated with pineal gland activation and higher consciousness. Why would a military fortification resonate at that frequency? Unless activating consciousness was exactly what it was designed to do. I'm going to say something now that will make me sound completely insane, but I need to say it because the data supports it. These structures weren't just power plants. They were more than that. They were designed to interact with human biology, with consciousness itself. Every frequency I've measured at star forts corresponds to frequencies used in therapeutic sound healing, in meditation, in practices designed to alter human consciousness. 528 hertz for DNA repair, 741 hertz for cellular detoxification, 852 hertz for spiritual awakening, 963 hertz for divine connection. These aren't random numbers. These are specific frequencies that affect human biology in documented, reproducible ways. What if the star forts weren't just generating power? What if they were generating an environment optimized for human health and consciousness evolution? What if that's the real reason they were destroyed? Think about it. If you wanted to control a population, what's the most effective way? Keep them sick, keep them tired, keep them operating at lower frequencies of consciousness, where they're easier to manipulate, easier to control, easier to extract labor and resources from. Now imagine a civilization where the very infrastructure of their cities was designed to keep people healthy, aware, operating at higher frequencies. A civilization where just walking through the city exposed you to beneficial resonances, where the water you drank was structured by geometric fields, where the buildings themselves supported biological and spiritual well-being. That civilization would be very difficult to control, very difficult to conquer, very difficult to exploit. So you'd destroy the infrastructure, You'd bury the technology. You'd replace it with systems that generate profit instead of well-being. And you'd rewrite the history to make sure nobody remembers what was lost. I know how this sounds. I know you're thinking I've gone too far, crossed from legitimate investigation into pure speculation. But look at what we live with now. Epidemic levels of chronic disease, depression, anxiety, autoimmune disorders, rates that keep climbing despite advances in medicine. We're told it's diet, lifestyle, stress, and those factors certainly contribute. But what if there's another factor? What if we're living in environments that are electromagnetically hostile to human biology? What if the infrastructure we replace the star forts with, power lines, cell towers, electrical grids operating at frequencies chosen for efficiency rather than biological compatibility? What if that infrastructure is slowly degrading our health? And what if some people know this? What if the suppression of star fort technology isn't just about energy monopolies, but about consciousness control? I can't prove that last part. Not yet. But I can prove the frequency correlation. I can prove the geometric design. I can prove the systematic destruction and burial. I can prove the classification and suppression of evidence. The rest is pattern recognition. And the pattern points to something much bigger than military architecture. Here's what I'm asking you to do. Document your local star fort site. Even if it's been demolished, even if all that remains is the street grid, document it. Take photographs. Take measurements if you can. Record the geometry. Share it. Post it online. Create a distributed database of evidence that can't be centrally controlled or suppressed, because they can classify government documents, they can seize private papers, they can bury physical structures, but they can't control millions of individuals all documenting the same patterns, all measuring the same frequencies, all recognizing the same truth. The evidence is everywhere, in the streets you walk, in the cities you live in the monuments they tell you are just historical curiosities. You don't need to believe me. You need to look for yourself. Search for star forts on Google Maps. Measure the geometry. Visit the sites that remain. Feel the resonance. And then ask yourself why this technology was buried. Ask yourself who benefits from your ignorance. Ask yourself what else you've been taught to forget. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just waits for enough people to start asking the right questions. And I think we're reaching that critical mass. I think more people are noticing the patterns, feeling the resonance, questioning the official narratives. I think the suppression is starting to fail, because you can't suppress truth indefinitely. You can delay it, obscure it, punish those who speak it, but eventually the evidence accumulates. The witnesses multiply. The pattern becomes too obvious to ignore. We're living in inherited cities, walking on buried power grids, surrounded by technology we've been trained not to see. But some of us are starting to see it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The star forts are still there, still resonating, still waiting, not for excavation, not for restoration, waiting for us to remember what they are and what we could be if we reclaim that knowledge. The frequency is calling, the geometry is speaking, the evidence is everywhere. All you have to do is listen.